What is the disability protection? Under the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and the Fair Housing Act, disability means as follows. A person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment. A person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. The federal law, known as the Americans with Disabilities Act, created the term reasonable accommodation. The term largely refers to changes and assistance in the workplace to allow a person with a disability the opportunity to perform the essential functions of a job. It also refers to accommodations to allow equal access. Fair housing laws use the term reasonable modification. Reasonable modification means modifying the unit or housing structure to provide physical access to a person with a disability. It does not mean improving the unit or house. If a tenant with a disability requests a modification, then in order for the modification to be considered reasonable, it cannot cause undue financial or administrative burden to the housing provider, it cannot cause a basic change in the nature of the housing programs available, it cannot cause harm or damage to others, and it must be technologically possible. So how do reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications apply to residential rental property? In order to serve tenants with disabilities, a landlord must do the following. Allow reasonable modifications to the existing dwelling or common use areas in order to allow equal accessibility. Make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, practices, or services if necessary for persons with disabilities to access, use, and enjoy the housing. Permit the use of assistive animals. Designate parking spaces for persons with disabilities. So who pays? Guidance from HUD, who enforces the Fair Housing Act, says the following. The landlord pays for any costs of reasonable accommodations to rules, policies, practices, or services unless the costs are an undue burden. Landlords must allow tenants to make and pay for necessary reasonable modifications of a unit or common use area. Today, many modifications for people with disabilities have been incorporated into the rental property's design and construction. That is because the Fair Housing Act requires all multifamily dwellings built after March 13, 1991, meet certain minimum accessibility and adaptability standards in interior and exterior design. A written request for a reasonable accommodation or modification is a good idea, but not required. A landlord may ask to inspect or review site plans by the contractor doing the modifications at the tenant's expense and demand that they are completed in a workmanlike or professional manner. Aesthetics is not a defense in denying a modification request. Let's talk about verification. Unless the disability is obvious or otherwise known, under fair housing and civil rights laws, landlords may request verification from a medical professional or professional service provider that indicates a tenant requires a reasonable accommodation or modification. While a modification or accommodation request only requires a minimal disclosure of disability, disclosure may speed up the request process. The landlord must keep these kinds of records confidential. True or false? A landlord rents to a tenant who uses a